Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with the Journal of Emily Shore. We have made it to the year 1837. She has just turned 17 years old, and we are on page 177 of this 1891 edition. If you don't know what this is my read aloud series of the 1830s diary of a teenage girl in the United Kingdom. And you can hop right in and listen to this video, or you can find the Emily Shore playlist on my channel page and start right back at the beginning. I think we've got somewhere around the range of 30 to 40 videos in this series at this point. And so here we are, beginning the year 1837. This chapter will take us from January 10th to July 17th of 1837. Emily Shore will be at Exeter, Sidmouth, Tynemouth, Picton, Marlden, Torquay, and Exeter again. And we do begin with a substantial editor's note here. As I've mentioned in past videos, her journal was edited after her death by her surviving siblings. This chapter, whose opening finds Emily just past her 17th birthday, and therefore fairly entered upon womanhood, seems to furnish an opportunity for touching on some points which could not be looked for in the journal or are not fully explained there. Some of the natural feelings of her age were now unfolded in her. She was no longer exclusively the student and the observer. She enjoyed the society and some of the lively amusements of the girls and young women around her. At the same time, we find, for the first time in her life, occasional tendencies to deep sadness. But in the period contained in the next 4 volumes, we find 2 features of her character so developed as by degrees to throw her former tendencies into the shade. These were an ardent piety and a turn for passionate friendship. And piety, religious feeling, is certainly something new to be introduced into the journal here. And we got a little bit of that in one of the previous readings. I think it was the last one I did, where suddenly she's talking about, piety and religious feeling, something that she's never concerned herself with, never touched on before. Perhaps it is a side effect of the realization of her own mortality. But yes, that will be new, and also passionate friendship. Throughout the journal so far, she's been far more interested in, solitary amusements than in the society of friends. Neither of them tended much to her happiness. Her piety was self-reproachful, for she could not satisfy the claims which the severe creed she believed in made on her. Her friendships, always for women somewhat older than herself, whom she revered as wiser and better than she, or for girls of her own age, whom she thought she could be of use to and raise to her own spiritual and intellectual level, were too devoted and absorbing for the peace of mind linked with so weak a frame. Of the former kind of friendships, we find here the first birth of the one that was henceforth almost to engross her heart, that for a most attractive family, and for one of them especially, whom she believed not wrongly to be the type of all but angelic goodness in woman's form, and towards whom she merged all her own powers and tendencies to warn, to counsel, and command in childlike reverence and lover-like attachment. She was a sunflower forever turning to the sun. Her good sense corrected many exaggerations, many idealizations on other subjects, but this feeling remained unchanged to the last. No girl, perhaps ever, had much insight into character, and her first judgments were no more divinations than any of those passed by youth and inexperience. But her instincts, to use a phrase somewhat unmeaning in this connection, in the end always clung to the worthy and let go the worthless. During this summer season, amidst romantic scenes and happy youthful companionship, there sprang up one special acquaintance in which her part was maintained with such a pure and quiet simplicity as made it appear scarcely to disturb the peaceful balance of her being. Yet one almost shrinks from recalling even the pretty incidents of this innocent love story, buried as they are under the ashes of years, and the earth in which the actors have long reposed. Indeed, over all things like these, the intense maiden modesty of her nature kept a seal. Her heart was a shrine whose veil was never, or but a corner of it, lifted. What she had to reveal of actual incident was told only to her mother, and of her own feelings she never spoke, even to her, except in a few slight words on her deathbed. For though more than once in her young life she had experienced admiration and something more, what feeling she had to give in return remains an enigma. It was scarcely her time to love. Beside, her life had many a hope and aim. In truth, her heart was as full as it could hold. The first love, and that which remained strongest to the last, was for her parents. I will attempt no picture of her outward appearance, but only quote a friend who described her at the age of 18 as pretty, pretty Emily, like a flower, so bright and delicate. She was never, we think, known once to allude to her personal appearance. A younger sister, thinking to please her, told her of the admiration expressed for her by a young man at a first chance sight. She was silent, and then, in a changed, grave tone, said, "You ought not to have told me that." And so that is the end of our introduction, and we will begin with the first entry for January 10th of 1837, which was a Tuesday. I read to Anna some of Scott's lesser poems, which are great favourites of mine, namely The Grey Brother, The Wild Huntsman, The Fire King, Helvellyn, and a part of the Glenfinlas. Helvellyn, I think, a most beautiful little poem, far superior to that of Wordsworth on the same subject. The third stanza is perfectly sweet, and here we have a note. The selection is very just. The third stanza begins with the charming lines, "How long didst thou think that his silence was slumber? When the wind waved his garment, how oft didst thou start?" She is right, too, in preferring the poem to Wordsworth's, which I think is shambling and prosaic in comparison. The Grey Brother is a singular ballad. It is but a fragment, and the conclusion exceedingly disappoints one, especially as there is something very fearful and mysterious in the last stanza. Glenfinlas I hardly understand throughout, but I think it is one of the finest little poems that has ever been composed. It was Mr. Howard who first pointed it out to me and recommended me to read it, and the same too of Helvellyn and many other poems which I am very fond of. January 11, Wednesday. I read to Anna The Ancient Mariner, which is a prime favourite of mine. It is a most extraordinary poem, unlike any other that ever was written, singular in conception and exquisite in execution. The latter part of the verse 4 and part 5, the air is cut away before and closes from behind, struck me as such a singular idea that I actually started as I read it. January 15th, Sunday. We hear that this kind of attack, which they call an influenza, is extremely prevalent and fatal. The newspapers say that in London there are 600 policemen and 300 banking clerks all ill at once. This indeed may not be true. Indeed, I feel inclined to strike off a cipher from each number. It is very fatal in Exeter. Mr. Tripp preached on the subject today from the text PS 3I, and said he never knew death so busy as at present. There were 9 burials in his parish last week. Mr. Trevelyan, an old gentleman whose pew my cousins share in church, told them that he has now 8 ill in his own house. The complaint seems to be spreading like the cholera of 5 years ago. It is quite awful and melancholy. January 24th, Tuesday. The prevalence of the influenza, as it is called, being in reality the same low fever to which we at Woodbury are so subject, is really awful. There is scarce a family whom we know, either personally or by name, which has escaped, and in most of them the greater part of the individuals in each family are ill. It is raging too amongst the poor. Aunt Bell sadly wants an assistant to her servants and cannot get one. All are ill. We hear of it from every quarter. The word influenza is in everybody's mouth. The streets are quite thinned. Nobody is in spirits except Mrs. Holst, the person who sells Morrison's pills. She says their spread is quite wonderful and that she hears that in Bath they are almost universal. So much the better. 'Tis very good news. I do not understand why the complaint is called influenza. The name was coined about 6 years ago, but the complaint itself, I suppose, is as old as any other. 'Tis the common 14 or 21-day fever, more or less violent. After dinner, we walked to Exeter to pay visits and do shopping, and were out for about an hour and 3/4. We first called at the Mrs. Lees, number 4, Upper Summerland. They were ill with influenza. Then at Miss Baring's at 6 Lower Summerland. She was at home, but ill of the influenza. Thus, to our great joy, we escaped all 4 visits, and went straight on a call on Miss Wyatt in Lower Southernhay. Here we were admitted, but found Dr. Miller attending on her sister-in-law, Mrs. Wyatt, who is ill of the influenza. Then we went to the lodgings of Mr. Harrington to inquire for his sisters, and found them ill too. That seems like quite a risk. I know they obviously didn't know as much as we know about the spread of viruses in 1837, but you'd think they would realize it was a risk to take, poor frail Emily on visits when there's this dreadful influenza spreading, and you think the gravity of the situation would, really come home when they realize that every house they visit has this influenza. Emily should be home in quarantine, but I guess things were a little bit different 200 years ago. January 27th, Friday. Mr. Dornford dined on Wednesday at Dr. Miller's, where there was to be a large party, but almost everyone sent excuses on account of being taken with the influenza, and Dr. Miller himself was obliged to rise from the table in the middle of dinner and go to bed. It is said that 60,000 are ill at Berlin. It is not infectious, but an epidemic. That doesn't quite make sense. Not infectious, but an epidemic. As I said, virus is viewed a little bit differently 200 years ago. And that takes us to the end of January 1837. So we'll leave it at there for today.